think, yes, I agree with you. It seems like they're quite almost frightened to show people what it can be, because what that requires is a level of like data openness that perhaps businesses aren't familiar with Microsoft operating in that kind of way. Because ultimately, you get the best out of AI through context, and that context coming from an enterprise setting with all of that data that sits underneath it is all in Microsoft's hands. So
GTM AI Podcast with Jonathan Moss and Coach K, where you get the latest with AI and GTM today.
Hello, everybody. It is I, Coach K, and I am so honored and pleasure to have on this GTM AI Podcast, Paul Glover, my man. I've been basking in your greatness and glory online and just seeing some of the stuff you have around AI and automation and all the things you're doing. And I was like, I got to have this guy on and to bask in your glory and greatness and brilliance. So first off, I just want to say thank you. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me, and I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good, man. I appreciate it. Before we get into it, because I always love to get into the nitty gritty of AI stuff, but I want to know you as a human first. So before we get to all the goody stuff, let's go into the better stuff about you. Because your background is like pretty fascinating. You come from being a business analyst and doing a ton of stuff from a little bit different point of view from AI. So I love your background, and I know that influences where you are now. So tell me a little bit more about your personal journey and how you got to be where you are now. And tell me more about that.
Yeah, so I've been working in tech for about 10 years, something like that. Most of the time, as you said, it's from a business analyst perspective. And I think over the last few years, I've just started to get really interested into AI. And I guess a couple of years ago, I had this kind of thought in my head that really, when you're thinking about an AI interaction with an LLM, it's almost like a mini microservice. And you can link those things together to get loads of value out of it. So I started my own small business called PromChain around that. And that was an interesting place just to learn. And I guess I've been focusing on it ever since, about how you get the most value out of it and what you can utilize it for in an enterprise setting.
Yeah, I love it, man. I know you're with Burendo right now as the principal consultant. So for people who have no idea what the heck Burendo is or what a principal consultant does, break it down for me. What's Burendo and what do you do?
Yeah, so Burendo is a consultancy in the UK, about medium-sized one. We do a lot of public sector work and private sector work. And in there, as a principal consultant, I tend to account lead sometimes for our clients, but also I run the AI community of interest there. And we've also done quite a bit of testing on how you can utilize AI in the product delivery process from a productivity perspective, just to make sure that as a business are serving our clients in the best possible way, but also our clients can get the most out of AI in their process. There's quite a lot of information out there, and it's difficult really for businesses to digest that and put it into practical actions. So what we're trying to do is pull that kind of intelligence together into some kind of product delivery process and then test it so that we can support our clients with that knowledge.
I love it, man. So when you work with people, like what kind of people do you work with, and what is usually the issues they come to you with, and what do you guys do to execute and solve the problems? What's the normal thing?
Yeah, so I think it could be anything from training people on agile principles to implementing business tools. To one of the big projects we did was the COVID pass during the COVID pandemic, where we worked with them on building that from a technology perspective. A lot of engineering work involved in that, but also understanding it from a business analyst perspective too, because there's loads of different moving parts. So I would say it's standard support in tech delivery, really, from a consultancy perspective, to position ourselves in the strategic partner lane rather than being in body shop. So it's about us making sure that we are at the top of our game from a knowledge perspective, so we can pass that on to our clients.
Yeah. So when you have coming into 25, I'm curious on two things. As you look back over this last year of 2024, what's been the patterns of what people are at, like in experimentation mode, or like in what's the ROI of this? Like, where have people been out? And then the second part of that question is, where do you think we're going? What's going to be happening next year from your view?
Yeah, so from an AI perspective, I think what people are doing are really seeing individual use cases, and I think there's a lot of undercover, like looking at it, in terms of staff. So a lot of them will be using things like ChatGPT and some of these tools, but not in a really official capacity, just in support of their role. So I think what organizations are looking at is how to apply AI to their processes and business to get the value out of it, but it's quite opaque and moves really quickly. And so there's a challenge really around how they go about doing that. We want to support with that. I want to support with that. And there's been a lot of research around these kind of tools to understand how.
Nice. So where do you feel like it's going to be going? Like, what's the shift?
I think from a shift perspective, one of the key things that I see is tools like Jira and Azure DevOps are starting to come into their own with this kind of automation perspective. So Jira's just got some agent functionality that's come out that allows you to automate parts of that process. Azure DevOps is a plugin from a company called Modern Requirements that does something similar. So as these tools start to come along, you're going to start to see behaviors such as creating features off the back of what's in an epic and that kind of stuff, and just where can AI support the process to do some of the heavy lifting and make it more productive in general? So I think we're getting to the point where these individual tools are starting to become enterprise in nature, but then there are still companies like Microsoft throwing billions at things which people use a little bit, but are struggling to see the strong value from Copilot. Yeah, so I would say that where the market is going is definitely towards a more enterprise implementation of utilizing AI to take some of the heavy lifting away from the people at the front line. And I think tools like Cursor and GitHub Copilot are good examples of that.
Yeah, I see. It's interesting you bring up Copilot because for me, Copilot, I mean, it's okay, but me being a deep dive in a lot of AI tools, I'm like, there's so much more. If they like fully unleashed the power of AI inside of Microsoft, I think it'd be awesome. I don't think they have. I think they've governed it down a lot. Like you have the output tokens from Copilot is small, so I can't get barely anything out of it. And then even the output tokens in, and then you get all the things you could be doing that they're not doing. I'm like, guys, unleash that beast. That thing would be awesome if you let it go. But it's not there yet.
Yeah, there are other companies that are doing something similar along those lines that are doing better at it. MoveWorks is a good example. I think Writer is another good example of that. And I think, yes, I agree with you. It seems like they're quite almost frightened to show people what it can be, because what that requires is a level of like data openness that perhaps businesses aren't familiar with Microsoft operating in that kind of way, because ultimately you get the best out of AI through context, and that context coming from an enterprise setting with all of that data that sits underneath it is all in Microsoft's hands. So they could really utilize that to produce something fantastic, but I think they're a little bit scared of doing so. And they did recently get burned by that tool that took screenshots as you worked, which they should have really saw coming.
Yeah, a little bit of a problem there. I'm curious on your thoughts on this because, like, I feel like because AI was the thing, so 23 came out, and then everyone started saying, we have AI. So, like, everyone wanted to say they have AI. It's Copilot. But then you start using it like, it's okay. And I think a lot of people who are not as nerdy with AI as I am, and probably you are, when they experience that, they're like, this is okay. This is what the buzz is about. Give me a break. Versus those who like actually dive in, they go, this is awesome, because they can see how powerful it is. Like, where do you see AI actually being applied in most cases with businesses that makes the biggest differences that you've seen so far?
Yeah, and that's what we're doing a lot of research on. And I think it's a moving target, and I think that's a really important thing to pay attention to, because so at the moment you could utilize tools like, one of the tools that we think is really useful is Cloud Projects. And that gives you the opportunity then to store a lot of information in what's essentially what we call a RAG database, which I'm sure, but just for some of your listeners who might not, that's essentially like a database of things like PDFs and markdown documents that you sit underneath your AI when you're having a conversation with it, that helps inform the answers that you get from it. We've done quite a bit of testing on that and found that to be a really useful tool in the delivery phase, business analysis, that kind of thing. Doing things like putting call recordings in there, your transcripts alongside requirements documents or any information you have on a domain basis, and all of that information pulled together then allows you to do a really lean process in terms of documenting it. And I think documentation is something that in Agile in particular is perhaps not focused on as much as it used to be in the old waterfall processes. And if you think about that, that makes total sense, because in waterfall, you might spend several weeks producing a document, and by the end of it, it's probably out of date and it's based on knowledge that you're not 100% sure on. Whereas in a AI first Agile process, you're really looking at it from, well, that document can be produced instantly based on the information that you already had. And then really what you're doing is looking at that and criticizing it. And what we found is it's much easier to look at a document and then change it because it's wrong than it is create it from brand new. So one of the key concepts in some of the methodologies that we're thinking about and testing is putting something in front of someone from to criticize is less cognitive load and therefore quicker. So that's where we're aiming
It's funny is in general, that's how I think how powerful AI is in general is that I'd rather have something I can critique and tear apart than have to create in the first place. Because like even creating something like with thought leadership, for example, AI can't do my thought leadership for me. I have to do it. But the nice thing
Yeah.
is that I can use AI to just spiel on a Zoom on my voice memo and throw it to Slack and it goes to an automation piece that goes and makes form out of it because it's so nice. Instead of me having to think, okay, which paragraph should come first and what should the title be and what this thing be, I can just talk. And then the AI can do all the other stuff of executing the documentation so it's consumable. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that alone is so powerful. But then
But
to your point, when
you've
you
got to
think
think of it
about
on
it,
different levels, though, Jonathan. I think there's that level of being able to see the information. Let's say you put a load of call recordings in there and you have a document and you go back to it in 3 months
yep.
and you want to ask a question again. It can search through all of that information practically instantaneously for you and provide you an answer. But then the flip side of that is that documentation isn't utilized in the same way if you're having an AI first process that you would utilize it in the past. Because in the past, that documentation, perhaps would be read, and then someone would then go and develop that, and it'd be about interpretation. Whereas now it's much more of a statistical effort, really. What you're trying to do is create a series of documentation that will take some of the effort away from code production. And you can measure that. So if I produce a set of documentation utilizing AI and put it through a process, how many bugs that gets created out of that, or challenges that gets created out of that is a measurable thing that I can then move. So in one of the tests we did for instance, we utilized this kind of structure to create some code. And then we found in that code a common problem. And then we could take that common problem, go back and look at the code standards documentation that we'd used to create it and see if it was in there. And we saw that it wasn't, could update that code status, that code documentation. So the next time we produce code, it just doesn't exist. And this is the kind of self-improving process that you can utilize, always keeping human at the heart of it, of course, to try and remove some of that effort from people. You might only remove 30% of the effort if you're just using single shot prompts through something like ChatGPT or Claude. But then if you build a RAG database that's behind it, you have a self-improving process that happens around it, you use some good prompt engineering techniques, you might be able to lift that into 40, 50, 60%. And all of that is just added productivity and accelerate that delivery process. Because ultimately in Agile, the primary measure of progress is working software, right?
Yes, I love that you bring that up. My point of saying is it all starts with documenting something in the first place, because like you can't have a RAG system over nothing. You have to have something to have a RAG system on. So you have to
Yeah.
have something, whether it's data, like me with thought leadership. It doesn't matter what it is. It's like the best part about AI is creating formed to unformed, whatever. So I love that you're taking the next level because there's a team I work with. It's called Momentum. And they literally do the RAG system on top of call transcripts to then formulate it into a CRM or into Slack or different places. But it's awesome. So
Yeah.
it's taking the same concept. My
Yeah.
question to you though is that going to this process thing is that I saw a post the other day about AI that when you have an old process and you slap AI on top of it, you're making an old process faster, which is not necessarily the best thing to do. With
Yeah.
Agile, you're being more iterative and changing as you need to. So with this in mind, with any type of process, whether it's a sales process, whether it's a coding process, whatever process it might be, at what point do you come into businesses and you say, this is not a good process to AIify? We need to change the process. Like, where's the balance between that?
Yeah, I think that's probably something that is still to be discovered. The implementation of these kind of processes is very early, but what we could talk about is some fundamentals because it has to work for the organization at hand. But
Yeah.
there are some fundamentals that'll work for all organizations, which is about making context key. And that's about making sure that you're storing all of the information that you gain, any calls that you have in a methodology that allows you to then access it in the future. Because what we can't do is hang our hat on any particular tool. The market's moving too quickly for that. What we can do is hang our hat on the fundamentals that underpin all of those tools, which is making sure your context is right, making sure that you're looking at things from different points of view. So for instance, your RAG database might be use case specific. You might have a RAG database that stores a lot of information in there about how to be a great product owner, so that when the product owner's taking actions, they're utilizing domain information. It lifts their quality of work and therefore or reduces the amount of time it takes for them to complete a task. So I would say that, yeah, the thing that we would advise on most is getting those fundamentals right, because then any tool that you have is going to always be building upon them. because you'll have the right data structure that sits underneath it, and therefore the right context to get the most out of that AI tool.
No, I love it. When you say AI tools, you're talking more like the open APIs of Claude or Gemini or whatever the tool you're talking about. You're talking about others.
Potentially, it might be Claude, it might be Cursor, it might be Bolt, it might be. These new tools are coming out faster than you can keep up with them. And I think as one of the key things that we teach organizations and will continue to teach is that don't take our word for it. The first thing you should do is set up a group that tests these things in a controlled way with some real data behind it and see if it has benefit for you as an organization. And then as these new tools come out, you can just keep working in that kind of way. You definitely don't hang your hat on any particular tool, and even in any particular platform. The Microsoft versus Google, as a for instance, the tools that sit underneath those various different things are updating and changing all the time. OpenAI was king not that long ago, and now they're a little bit behind the march compared with some tools.
Right. Do you, when it comes down to, what's the word? Making sure that the output is what you're wanting it to be. And like when you're talking to teams who are not experts in this, and so they're trying to figure it out, like when they don't know, they don't know. How do you help them understand what to measure so they know what they're getting is good? Does that make sense? What's that process like?
That's all about making sure that you understand outcomes. So what's our outcome? Our outcome might be code that is of the standard and quality and structure that an organization already has before. That's a measure. And can we produce that code utilizing the document structure we have already? Or does the document structure we have already create challenges in doing so? And if it does, that's a feedback process, isn't it? So definitely don't think to yourself, this sounds complicated. This is something I can't do myself. Of course you can. But you can talk to any of these tools and create a requirements document, and you can use that requirements document to then create code. And then you can look at that and think, this is terrible. What can I do to improve that by changing my documentation? And anybody can start that. And it's going to be different for different organizations because they have their own different code structures, different domain information. And so approaching that in a different way is going to be the best thing for them. I don't think there is a one size fits all, or if there is, we don't know what it is at the moment. So definitely it's an iterative, feedback driven process. Try and get the AI to help you. Look at how successful it does that, see what errors that it has in that process, and then see what you can do about improving perhaps the information that sits in the RAG database that produces it, or perhaps the prompts that you're asking. Or one of the key things we think is even the size of your question. So if you want a good answer from AI, keep it as simple as possible. And that might mean creating modular software so that really you're only looking at a single module when you're doing that. It might mean creating code files, which are single responsibility. It might mean splitting information that you would normally keep in one really good document into 5, because the ability to produce those documents, amend those documents, and ingest those documents are now nearly an instant process. So one of the key concepts that we're looking at is what we call a holodeck theory, which makes sense if you're a Star Trek. But it's about you have an idea and you have the realization of that idea, and anything in between that is friction, essentially. Not my job, but friction. So it's about how do we reduce that friction as much as possible? And sometimes that means supplementing your standard process, or sometimes that means supplementing your standard process, realizing that doesn't work, and then changing it up. And that's scary for people. One of the criticisms, or not criticisms, but feedback more I tend to hear a lot, is people worried about the jobs in these situations. And I've seen what happened with Stack Overflow and the internet when that came out to the tech markets. I feel like people should have a bit more faith in their own ability to add value. I think what this kind of thinking methodology does is add productivity. And there are organizations who will use that to cut people. And then there are organizations who will use that to accelerate value delivery for their customers. And when those two organizations compete, I think we both know which one will be successful. So I see this really as an acceleration of value delivery. And at the moment, we're in the opening stages of that. But as we talked about earlier, some of the enterprise tools are catching up with it. And it's a really key time to make sure that you get the structure of data that sits underneath all of these tools as right as possible, as quick as possible, because that's just going to accelerate your delivery.
Totally. So if I can ask, because I would love, if you don't mind, you can use obviously an anonymous customer name, but I'd love to have you break down for this process. You talk about like creating a RAG profile and all the documentation. What was the output? Give me an example of what was the problem someone had when you applied this thinking to their problem. What was the output results of it that affected business? If you can break it down for me, I'd love to hear like a real-time problem story with a customer.
Yeah, so we had a customer who wanted a healthcare app creating, and we do a lot of healthcare. And in terms of this, what they wanted to do was do it from a funding perspective. So they were looking to achieve a funding round with that, and they were looking for a prototype as quick as possible. So we wanted to apply AI processes to that, because that saves our effort and makes it nice and quick for the customer. So what we did with that is took a lot of the initial data that we had from it, put all of that into a RAG database, and sat with a small team where we just discussed what those requirements would look like back and forth until we got to, in about an hour, a position where we felt quite comfortable with those requirements. And then we could pick those requirements up and just ask tool to produce the code for it. And that took us from initial concept to the point where we had a thin prototype in about 75 minutes, and it took us another 15 minutes to put another iteration on top of that. And then in order to have a reasonable front end that they're comfortable with, that was another maybe hour call where we go through various different front end designs using VO. And it's essentially about squeezing all of the effort out of that process, where typically that kind of thing, you have a conversation with the customer and you might write down some notes, and then you'll go and write all that down to make sure they have an understanding, and they'll check it with it. We want to make sure that process is a lot more back and forth and a lot more with the customer in the room, and they see the changes straight away. We want to be able to develop at the speed of thought, really. We don't want to be waiting for a whole lot of friction to happen before we can get right back in them with the customer. So I think that enabled us to, in several hours, move the customer forward in a position that perhaps might have took a couple of weeks in more traditional methods. But it's still very much a prototype process. I think implementing that in a strong enterprise setting is something that we have yet to do in a strong way. So it's very conceptual at the moment, but coming from a place of testing it internally to make sure it works before we even talk to a customer about it.
Yeah, I love the thinking behind it. And this application is always the piece I'm always curious about to see what's the business value of this, which to me, I can hear because I've seen it in person, but with people who've never experienced that, it's awesome.
Yeah.
One last question, because it's something you posted about before that I really want to tap into with you, is this whole conversation around where does AI end and where does the human begin? So I'm curious with you, like, what is that line, and how does, when you inject yourself as a human inside this whole process and then you inject yourself out, where does that end and start for you? What do you think?
I think we want to move in as much of a risk-free and data-based methodology as we can. So I think where it ends and begins is that you keep your current process and you just utilize this to accelerate the value that each person delivers. So you utilize it as a series of juniors. So I'm a business analyst. So it's like you're giving it to a junior business analyst. Give me a first draft of this requirements document. We'll peer review it together. And that's something that I think there was an article in Nature that talked about system zero thinking, whereas there's traditionally been system one and system two's thinking. System zero thinking is almost a new thing where you're using AI as an external hard drive for your brain. Yeah, and it's that kind of thinking of how can I plus AI produce this document, this method of thinking, facilitate this meeting, anything really that adds value to the moving forward of create test cases, anything that moves it forward. How can I do that to the best of my ability? And then it's a concept that we're thinking about is min-maxing, like in video games. If you want to have the best dwarf with a wonderful hammer and great golden armor, it's all about making sure you get that last 2 or 3% of damage out of it by doing all this effort. We think this process is no different. We're almost machine operators now, like operating alongside the AI and giving our creativity and special knowledge to lift up the output that the AI produces at each stage. But similarly, as mechanics of that process, we want to make sure that we are lifting that 30 or 40% value to 50, 60, 70% value. And at some point, there'll be certain tasks that we can take that we can just hand off. And then we don't need to do them anymore because our job is adding value. It's not writing user stories or creating BPMN diagrams. If there's a tool that can do that for us, then let's utilize it and then keep adding value.
Yep, I agree. I love it. Tell me this. I know we're pretty much at time, but what's the best way for people to get in touch with you if they want to talk to you more?
Yeah, you can contact me on paul.glover@burendo.com.
Cool. That's nice and easy. I'll make sure, if you're okay with it, I'll include your LinkedIn profile as well in the show notes to make sure people can get you that way too. But Paul, thank you. This is awesome. Love being able to tap into your brain a little bit. So I just want to say thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. And if you're interested in some of these ideas, there is a website with this kind of stuff on, automatedagile.co.uk. Don't expect too much, but I think there's some basics there about how you can get the most out of this process. And it's just our thoughts that we've learned so far.
Love it. I'll make sure I include because I know I have your link too. So I'll make sure I have the link in the show notes as well. So I have your LinkedIn, your email, and then your automated agile link, which is great. Because sometimes the minimalist and to the point is good. So I like it.
Yeah, definitely. That's what you'll get.
I like it. Good. Paul, thank you so much,
man.
man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a good talk.
Thanks for listening to the GTM AI Podcast. Please follow, subscribe, like, comment, and come back for more.